Luoyang in the early months of the year 26 of the Common Era. The city has served as capital of the restored Han Dynasty for less than 12 months. Before dawn, in a walled mansion belonging to a marquis on one of the city's eastern wards, a bondmaid steps out of an unheated room off the kitchen courtyard and begins drawing water from the well for the morning fires. She is perhaps 12 or 13. Her exact age is not recorded anywhere because girls in her position were not the subject of anyone's records. What Han officials were required to record and to update as county registers were rebuilt after the recent wars was the count of a household's inhabitants, land, animals, and bonded labor. By that kind of count, the mansion behind her holds 31 people: the marquis and his wife, his one resident concubine, his 4 children, a tutor retained for his sons, a steward who manages the estate's accounts, 6 retainers, free men attached to the household by their own choice, and 16 slaves, of whom the girl at the well is one. Of the 31, 16 are legally the marquis's property and cannot leave the grounds without his permission. 24 years earlier, in the year 2, Han officials had completed the most thorough census the dynasty would ever produce: 12,233,062 registered households and 59,594,178 individuals, a population larger than that of any other state on Earth at the time, and by most modern estimates, larger than the Roman Empire under Augustus. That figure described conditions that no longer held by the year 26. Between the census and this particular morning, the empire had passed through the usurpation of Wang Mang, a court official who deposed the child emperor of the Western Han dynasty, declared a new Xin dynasty in the year 9, and spent the next 14 years attempting to nationalize agricultural land, abolish private slavery by decree, and replace the currency through 4 reforms that put more than 30 denominations of coin, shell, and cast bronze knife money into simultaneous, chaotic circulation. Each reform failed. Famine followed the collapse of the land policy in the Yellow River Valley. The Red Eyebrows and Lulin rebellions followed the famine. Rebel forces killed Wang Mang when they stormed his palace in Chang'an in the year 23, and Liu Xiu, a minor descendant of the deposed Han imperial clan, spent the following 2 years defeating his rivals before proclaiming himself emperor in the year 25. History remembers him by his temple name, Guangwu. He chose Luoyang, cheaper to defend and undamaged by the recent fighting, as his capital in place of the ruined Chang'an. By the next reliable census, in the year 57, the registered population of the restored empire would stand at just over 21 million, a fraction of the year 2 figure, and a measure of what the intervening decades had cost. This reconstruction draws on the administrative statutes and household registers preserved in the Book of Han and the Book of the Later Han, the household and mourning codes of the Book of Rites, the ceramic tomb models known as Mingqi that Han households commissioned for burial, and the inventory slips and grave goods recovered from aristocratic tombs, such as those excavated at Mawangdui in modern Hunan province. The mansion itself follows a pattern Han builders extended for a family of rank into a sequence of walled courtyards arranged one behind another along a single north-south line, each bordered by timber halls and linked to the next by covered corridors, so a resident could move from front to rear without stepping into open weather. Almost none of the actual timber survives into any later century. Fire, war, and ordinary decay destroyed nearly every wooden structure the Han dynasty built. What survives instead are the miniature clay models, wealthier households buried with their dead, green-glazed courtyards complete with granaries, wells, pigsties, and, standing over the gate, multi-story watchtowers, some more than a meter tall, even in miniature, with tiny figures posted at the windows holding crossbows. The watchtower over this particular gate is not decorative. Eastern Han, in the assessment of archaeologists who study these tomb models, was an unsettled period, and an armed retainer posted above a fortified gate was a reasonable precaution for a household with property worth protecting. The war against Wang Mang's regime had ended in the capital, but not yet in the provinces. To the northwest, the General Wei Xiao still held the region around Tianshui against the new emperor's authority, The resistance he led would not end until 34. In the Sichuan Basin, a former Qin dynasty administrator named Gongsun Shu had proclaimed himself emperor of a rival state called Chengjia, the same year Guangwu took the throne, and would go on ruling an independent empire with its own currency until his death in 36. The Red Eyebrows, the rebel army that had briefly held Chang'an itself, would not be defeated until the following year, 27. Full military reunification of the empire under Guangwu lay a decade in this mansion's future. The bondmaid's first task after building up the kitchen fires is to sweep the approach to the mansion's ancestral hall, a separate structure within its own walled section of the compound, and to renew the offerings of grain and wine left before wooden tablets bearing the names of the Marquis's deceased father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. The Book of Rites, a Confucian ritual text reaching something close to its Han-era form during this period, treated filial piety toward the dead as a formal obligation rather than a private sentiment. Sacrifice at the tablets on fixed days, mourning periods graded by the closeness of the relationship, 3 years owed to a father, 1 year to a mother, and a household hierarchy in which even the Marquis, supreme head of the family in the eyes of the law, could not injure his own children, without becoming liable, like any other subject, to prosecution for assault. The same code that granted him near total authority over the people attached to his household also placed limits on how far that authority could be exercised. Limits a Han magistrate was, at least in principle, required to enforce. The compound observes a division stated directly in the Book of Rites. Men do not speak of what belongs within the household, and women do not speak of what belongs outside it. In practice, the outer courtyards nearest the main gate, where the Marquis receives visitors, conducts business with his steward, and periodically entertains officials passing through the capital, are treated as male space, while the rear courtyards, reached through a second, smaller gate, belong to his wife, his concubine, his unmarried daughters, and the female slaves who attend them. Nothing physically locks the boundary in place. It is maintained instead by daily custom, reinforced by the fact that different corridors, courtyards, and in a mansion of this size, different kitchens serve the two halves of a single family. The Marquis dresses, with a body servant's help, in a robe of dark silk cut in the cross-collared style used throughout Han China, the right side folding over the left, a convention Han writers treated as distinguishing civilized dress from that of peoples beyond the frontier. Registered merchants trading in Luoyang's markets were required by law to wear undyed hemp regardless of personal wealth, a rule meant to remind them of their formerly low legal standing next to farmers, officials, and the nobility. The Marquis's household observes no such restriction, since silk, along with the right to ride rather than walk and the right to hold public office, was reserved by statute to those above the rank of registered merchant. At his waist he wears jade ornaments expected by ritual convention to produce a measured, rhythmic sound as he walks, a sign of the deliberate pace considered appropriate to a man of rank. The color he is most likely to wear on any day involving formal business is a dark red. Since founding the restored dynasty, Guangwu's court had been reclaiming red as the Han dynasty's ritual color, tied in 5 phases cosmology to the power of fire. Wang Mang, during his usurpation, had claimed yellow instead, tied to the power of earth, on the theory that earth was fire's natural successor, and that his Qin dynasty had therefore inherited authority through the correct cosmological sequence rather than through naked usurpation. Reclaiming red asserted, in effect, that the sequence had been interrupted rather than completed. The Marquis's title sits within a graded system of 20 ranks, first codified under the Qin dynasty and inherited into Han law, running from a lowest rank of commoner distinction up through 18 intermediate grades to a 19th and 20th rank, both styles of Marquis, of which only the 20th carried an actual marquisate, a defined territory whose tax revenue belonged to its holder rather than the state treasury. A Marquis of modest standing, holding the nominal allegiance of roughly 1,000 households, could expect an annual income near 200,000 cash from that territory, collected by county officials and forwarded to him as a fixed sum regardless of the year's harvest. It was a comfortable income for a household of this size, though a small fraction of what court chroniclers described as the fortune of a truly successful merchant house, a class of men the Marques's own social code held in open contempt despite the wealth some of them commanded. Beyond his immediate family, the mansion houses three legally distinct categories of dependent labor. His retainers are free men who have attached themselves to his household in exchange for lodging, food, and clothing, and who may leave whenever they choose. In return, they serve as bodyguards, messengers, or advisors, and in times of crisis, as fighting men. Retainers of exactly this kind had made up a substantial part of the army with which Guangwu fought his way to the throne only the year before. His slaves are legally his property, cannot leave without his consent, and were acquired in this household's case mainly through private debt during the famine years of Wang Meng's reign, when a family unable to feed its children might sell a son or daughter into bondage rather than watch them starve. Slaves made up perhaps 1% of the empire's population nationally, a far smaller share than in the contemporary Roman world, and Han law, even before Guangwu's own reforms, made it a capital offense to kill a slave without legal cause. A king of the Han imperial house had been stripped of his kingdom in an earlier generation after it was found he had murdered one. A third category, tenant farmers working land the Marquis owns outside the city walls, rarely appear inside the mansion itself, since they live on the land they farm under contracts that return roughly half of each harvest to the landowner in exchange for the use of his fields, tools, and draft animals. Since proclaiming himself emperor, Guangwu had begun issuing the first of what would become 9 separate edicts over his reign, ordering the release of people who had fallen into private bondage during the recent famine and warfare, and requiring county officials to survey and rebuild the household registers the preceding years of chaos had destroyed or falsified. Surveys of exactly this kind were underway across the empire in the year 26 itself, along with orders for giving tax arrears accumulated under the fallen Qin regime. Whether any particular edict applied to a particular household's slaves depended on the circumstances under which each person had been bonded and on how quickly a given county's magistrate acted on instructions issued from a capital some of them had not yet visited. Inside the mansion, opinions on the question varied more than the law itself did. Past the inner gate, the Marquise's wife directs the day's household business from a sitting room she shares, by custom rather than by any written requirement, with his one resident concubine. Han households below the rank of king were legally monogamous, in the narrow sense that only one woman could hold the formal status of wife, but a man of the Marquise's means was expected, not merely permitted, to support one or more concubines besides her, and the children of a concubine carried the same legal claim on the family's inheritance as those of the wife, provided the wife had not already produced an heir. Custom held that a wife's authority within the household increased rather than diminished with age. A widowed mother retained legal and moral authority over her adult sons, who were expected to defer to her even after inheriting their father's title, and the Empress Dowager at the summit of Han society held, by law, the power to override a reigning emperor's own decisions. Between them, the Marquis's wife and his concubine divide responsibility for overseeing the female slaves who cook, weave, and clean, managing the household's stores of grain, cloth, and coin, and receiving the female relatives of other official families, since the same convention that keeps men out of the inner quarters keeps women just as firmly out of formal business in the outer hall. 2 of the Marquis's daughters spend the morning at a loom off the inner courtyard, producing silk cloth partly for family use and partly for sale, an occupation considered entirely respectable for women of every rank in Han society, unlike trade conducted by men, which the same Confucian value system treated as beneath a gentleman. His 2 sons, 7 and 11, sit instead with a tutor in the outer part of the mansion, memorizing passages from the Confucian classics that a government examiner would one day test them on if either sought office. The tutor's own standing rests on private study rather than a degree from the Imperial University in Luoyang, which in the year 26 still enrolled a modest number of students, a small fraction of the several thousand it would hold within the following century. No text yet existed instructing a household's daughters on their expected conduct in the terms that would later become standard across China. That text, called Lessons for Women, would be written some 80 years later by a woman named Ban Zhao, not yet born in the year 26 and not due to be born for another 19 years. Her father, an official named Ban Biao, was 23 this same year and had not yet begun the history of the fallen Western Han dynasty that his son, and eventually his daughter, would complete after his death. At midday, the household eats in 2 settings that mirror the mansion's internal divisions, and in practice, in 3. In the family's own dining hall, the meal is served on lacquered wooden trays, rather than the bronze vessels an earlier generation of Han nobility had favored, lacquerware having displaced bronze as the preferred tableware of wealthy households over the preceding century for being lighter, more colorful, and by this period cheaper to produce in quantity. The meal includes millet and wheat, prepared as grain and as noodles, a stewed dish of pork, a soup made from lotus root, dried jujube dates, and warmed rice wine. A century and a half earlier, in the kingdom of Changsha to the south, the tomb of a noblewoman remembered to history only as Lady Dai, wife of the Marquise of Dai, had been furnished for the afterlife with almost exactly this repertoire: lacquer trays, lotus root soup, jujubes, and a pair of lacquered chopsticks among the oldest such objects ever recovered by archaeologists, alongside a silk robe so fine it weighed less than 50 grams, despite measuring more than a meter in length. This household is smaller and poorer than hers had been, but the underlying idea of what a wealthy Han family's table ought to contain has not changed in the interval. In the kitchen courtyard, the 16 slaves eat what remains once the family's meal has been prepared and served: coarser grain, whatever vegetables were not chosen for the family's table, and water rather than wine, taken seated on the ground rather than at a raised table, since furniture of the kind used in the dining hall was itself a marker of status. The mansion's bonded servants were not given. The 6 retainers, being free men rather than property, eat a meal closer in quality to the family's own, in a separate hall near the main gate reserved for them, a distinction Han writers on hospitality treated as entirely proper and worth recording, since a host's generosity toward his retainers, unlike his provision for his slaves, was in itself understood as a marker of the host's own standing. In the early afternoon, the steward settles accounts with a cloth merchant who has come to sell dyed silk thread, and the transaction illustrates a problem that would not be fully resolved for another 14 years. Since Wang Mang's currency reforms, the coinage actually circulating across the restored empire is a confused mixture of Old Western Han Wuzhu coins, older Banliang coins predating the Han dynasty's founding, and Wang Mang's own Huoquan and Daquan Wushu issues, exchanging at values that shift by market and season rather than by any fixed standard. 200 miles to the west, in the rival state of Chengjia, Gongsun Shu had begun minting his own iron Wuzhu coins, adding a 4th currency to the 3 already in circulation across the region. The restored Han court had reintroduced the original bronze Wuzhu coin in principle upon Guangwu's accession, but the mints required to recast it at scale, and the administrative reach needed to withdraw the older, more confused currency would not be fully in place until the year 40. Until then, the steward and the merchant settle the day's transaction on a weight of silver alongside a mixture of coin types, a workaround common enough across the empire that year that neither man remarks on it. In the evening, the marquis receives no formal guests, and the household turns to its own entertainment. A group of 5 musicians, retainers rather than slaves in this household, though other families of similar rank owned their musicians outright, plays on bells, a drum, a set of pitch pipes, and a stringed instrument called a sei, while 2 young women trained for the purpose, in robes with long silk sleeves designed to trail and snap through the air as they move, perform a dance in the reception hall. It is exactly this kind of performer, caught mid-motion with her sleeves flung wide, that Han households most often chose to have modeled in clay for burial alongside them, and it is largely through those surviving grave figures, rather than any painting or textile that has come down intact, that the dance itself is known today. Afterward, the marquis and 2 retainers play a board game called liubo, moving black and white pieces across a marked board by the fall of bamboo throwing sticks. A descendant of the same Marquis of Dai cited earlier for this household's meal had been buried a century and a half before with a complete liubo set that included an 18-sided die, among the finest such sets archaeologists have recovered. Conversation over the evening turns, as it does at most tables of any standing in Luoyang that year, to the state of the war, to reports from the northwest, where Wei Xiao still refused to submit to the new emperor's authority, to the currency Gongsun Shu was said to be minting in Chengdu, and to the more comfortable fact repeated at dinner tables across the capital that the worst of the recent fighting appeared to have passed Luoyang by. By full dark, the mansion is lit by oil lamps, rather than by any single source large enough to illuminate a full room, mostly plain ceramic dishes holding a floating wick in animal fat, though the reception hall holds 2 lamps cast in bronze in the shape of standing human figures, a luxury object type recovered from a number of wealthy Han tombs, and, evidently, as much a feature of wealthy homes in life as of the burials that followed them. The bondmaid's final task of the day is to carry a fresh offering of wine to the ancestral hall and confirm that its lamp, kept apart from the others and never allowed to go out overnight, is still burning. At the main gate, beneath the watchtower, a retainer takes the first watch of the night, in a mansion that, like most households of rank in Luoyang that year, keeps an armed presence at its gate through every night regardless of how quiet the surrounding streets have been. The reconstruction ends where it began, outside the mansion's main gate, looking up at the watchtower against the night sky rather than forward through the doorway beneath it. Within the walls, a household of 31 people has completed a day that would repeat with only minor variation for as long as the Marquis held his title, and Luoyang remained secure enough to let him hold it there. Outside those walls, the empire the mansion belonged to was still, in the year 26, only partly reunified. Wei Xiao independent in the northwest for 8 more years, Gongsun Shu ruling his own empire in the southwest for 10 more, entire counties' household registers still being rebuilt from testimony rather than surviving documents, and the coin in every merchant's hand still a mixture of 4 currencies that would not be sorted into one for another 14 years. Some of what this household could not have known that night would arrive within a single generation. Full military reunification came 10 years later, in 36. The standard bronze Wuju coin returned to circulation at scale in 40. 80 years on, a court official named Kai Lun, working at the imperial workshops in this same city of Luoyang, refined a method for turning tree bark, hemp waste, old cloth, and discarded fishing net into sheets of paper light, and cheap enough to replace the bamboo strips and silk that had, until then, been nearly the only surfaces available for writing, a change that would eventually alter how information moved through China and much of the rest of the world more than any single edict, issued by any single emperor. Ban Biao's daughter grew up to help complete her father's and brother's history of the fallen Western Han dynasty, and to write the guide to female conduct that would shape the upbringing of households like this one for the better part of 2,000 years. None of that had happened yet. On the night this reconstruction ends, what had happened on this particular night was smaller and more immediate. A household fed across 3 separate tables, ancestral rites observed by lamplight, a currency still unsettled, a watch set at a gate. More than a century and a half after the fall of Wang Mang, Luoyang itself was sacked and burned in the year 190 by a warlord retreating from a military coalition raised against him at court, an event later Chinese writers would describe as having left the old capital unrecognizable to anyone who had known it before. What then did it mean to hold the title of Marquis in Luoyang in the year 26? To command a fortified mansion, a rank within a system of 20 grades, an income measured in coins of uncertain and shifting value, and a household of 31 people divided by law into 3 separate categories of person. It meant holding a title and a compound inside a political order that had not yet finished reuniting itself, in a capital that had existed as a capital for less than a year, behind walls built for defense against a conflict that had not, by any account available inside the mansion itself, entirely ended.